Thank you for that very kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. It is great to be here with you today. We have gathered here to think deeply about how, working together, we might unleash human flourishing. And so it is fitting that we've gathered here in New York, a city that has long represented ambition and opportunity for millions of Americans, whether native-born or newcomer. Here in Midtown, we are surrounded by soaring towers built by visionary entrepreneurs, investors, and craftsmen who took great pride in their work. Everywhere you look, the streets are teeming with some of the most talented, hardworking professionals in the country. This is the New York you see in the movies, and that captures the imagination of people from around the world. But as any New Yorker will tell you, this city of ambition and opportunity is about more than just Midtown. It is about the corners of New York you don't see as a tourist or as a business traveler. The neighborhoods where ambition and opportunity are nurtured in modest family homes and beloved churches and other places of worship. I want to talk a bit about this other New York and about my own little slice of it. My parents uprooted themselves from their native country almost half a century ago, and then moved half a world away to an unfamiliar, and by their standards, extremely cold place called Brooklyn. I've spent almost all my life there, and I'm now raising a family a short subway ride from the house where my parents raised me and my sisters. If you measure adventurousness by how far you've traveled from the place of your birth, well, my parents have me beat. Today, Brooklyn is best known for the hipsters who have brought affluence and artistic sheen to what was not long ago a deeply and proudly unfashionable borough. When I was in high school, I traveled to Berlin as part of an exchange program, and when I told one of my German counterparts where I was from, his eyes bulged, and he asked me, "Wow, do you belong to a street gang?" I thought about this for a moment, not quite sure how to respond. "Does the debate team count?" I replied innocently. "No, younger Reihan, no, it does not." But I certainly knew where he was coming from. Brooklyn in those years had yet to shed its reputation as a place of poverty, tragedy, and violence. When I was growing up, the borough was caught in the grip of the crack epidemic, and what looked like a long, slow, inevitable decline as middle-class families rushed for the exits. Beneath the surface, though, things were already changing. New York City elected new political leadership that began to turn the tide, thanks in no small part to better policing. And there were other changes too. Immigrants like my parents were revitalizing working and middle-class neighborhoods throughout the outer boroughs, and younger entrepreneurs launched craft breweries, digital media businesses, and stylish restaurants in once-abandoned streetscapes. You're all familiar with this story. It's a story we Brooklynites are very proud of. But I worry about the fragility of this new prosperity. I worry that it won't last because too many of us are losing sight of the principles that undergird this prosperity. If we Americans are to preserve our dynamism and strengthen our communities in the years to come, we must develop a deeper understanding of what made our communities places of opportunity in the first place. And for that, we must look to our history. In the 19th century, Brooklyn wasn't yet part of New York City. It was New York City's upstart neighbor, which fancied itself a less pretentious rival to the Big Apple itself, one that might someday surpass it. In the 1890s, Brooklynites found themselves locked in a fierce debate over whether or not to dissolve their independent city to become part of a consolidated Greater New York. Brooklyn's newspaper, the Brooklyn Eagle, cautioned its readers to think twice about tying their fate to Manhattan. After all, Manhattan was a land of economic extremes. The wealthy lived in opulence on Fifth Avenue, while the immigrant and native poor lived cheek by jowl on the Lower East Side and in the Five Points. These divergent fortunes and close proximity produced unseemly machine politics in the form of Tammany Hall. By contrast, Brooklyn, in the minds of its leading citizens, was a model of Tocquevillian community. It was the city of strivers who, upon making their own fortune, sought to help others in their ethnic and religious communities. Indeed, the Eagle was in the habit of referring to Brooklyn as the city of homes and churches. These tight-knit and bustling communities were overwhelmingly comprised of immigrants and their offspring. Beginning in 1880, the borough's already robust population growth was turbocharged by immigrants fleeing political upheavals, famines, and panics, pogroms, and persecutions. The Brooklyn they found was still mostly agricultural. In 1880, Kings County was the second largest provider of produce in the country, but changing rapidly as the country's growing rail network put the borough in direct competition with the famously fertile Midwest. As is always the case, the immigrant experience in Brooklyn began with the formation of ethnic enclaves. The Irish, German, Russian Jewish, and Italian immigrants were all eager for some familiarity and mutual aid in a strange new land. Rather than isolate them from the larger economy and culture of New York, these enclaves gave immigrants a chance to accumulate the social capital they would need to rise from the hardscrabble working class to the great American middle class. Today, the remnants of that all-important social capital are still visible in the borough's brick and clapboard tract houses and its beautiful churches, built with the hard-earned dollars of generations of working men and women who saw giving glory to God as no less essential than meeting the demands of daily life. The story of those homes and churches is the story of the opportunities and challenges that awaited those turn-of-the-century immigrants. First, the federal government was not going to interfere with or assist these newcomers. Indeed, those who arrived in adulthood in the 1880s might have lived their whole lives without ever interacting with the federal government outside of the post office. The upshot was that many of these immigrants entered an unencumbered and freewheeling manufacturing scene, stretching from the Navy Yard to Bushwick and into Red Hook. In these small-scale operations, they found success that would have been inconceivable to their relatives living on the edge of subsistence in the old country. Samuel Liebman, a German Jew, began Brooklyn's proud brewery tradition with Rheingold beer. Charles Pfizer, another German contribution to American innovation, decided to turn his own interest in chemical reactions into a pharmaceutical venture. Scottish-born John Arbuckle set up shop near the docks, where he developed a method for keeping South America's coffee beans fresher for longer than any of his competitors could manage. While these men made vast fortunes, countless other immigrants found more modest success in smaller manufacturing outfits that tinkered their way to new production methods in sugar, kerosene, packaged groceries, shoes, metal springs, soaps, handkerchiefs, kitchenware, steel wool, as well as coffee, beer, and glue. Then there were the homes. Acres and acres of homes that included boarding houses where young people looking to get on their feet could find a safe and affordable place to rest their head, to family-sized houses and apartments teeming with children. Some of today's most prized real estate in Brooklyn, the stately brownstones found all over the northern half of the borough, were originally built as tract housing at industrial scale for people of modest means. Many of these complexes were built by Brooklyn entrepreneurs who wanted to stave off criminality and blight. Alfred Treadway White built large complexes of multifamily walk-ups in Brooklyn Heights and Cobble Hill and ensured they had enough light and ventilation to be sanitary and comfortable. Jacob Rees, whose 1890 How the Other Half Lives sparked indignation about how the city's immigrant poor were housed, cited White's units as the beau ideal. Charles Pratt similarly took much of the proceeds from the sale of his oil company to John Rockefeller and built the Astral Apartments in Greenpoint, which provided immigrants with units that were fireproof, equipped with modern plumbing, and afforded access to both a communal library and an outdoor playground. Homes that we would all be proud to live in today. These acts of communal solidarity notwithstanding, Brooklyn added 500,000 residents in both the first and second decades of the 20th century. 1 million people in 20 years, far more than could be accommodated through good works alone. Instead, new arrivals and their families were housed in one of the 100,000 new units that New York City built each year, a stunning feat made possible by an absence of stringent regulations of a zoning code. The city would not adopt its first until 1916, and technological breakthroughs that made this building possible. Now, I don't want to go too far in romanticizing Brooklyn of a century ago. There was much to be lamented. For one, people were poorer and sicker than they are today, and they would have marveled at many of the conveniences we take for granted. The freedoms of urban life and the stresses of making ends meet created their fair share of broken homes and barroom brawls. What's more, it was not unusual for Jewish and Catholic communities to organize volunteer groups to stand guard at night to ensure know-nothing gangs did not defame the churches and synagogues they had worked so hard to build. Yet there was great, powerful, ennobling thing about the city of homes and churches. It was an entrepreneurial city, a magnet for striving families and striving communities that sought not just prosperity, but a prosperity rooted in principle. This was a city of modest homes, of a private life that was enriched by familial love and togetherness, and churches, places of worship and the cultivation of virtue, where communities came together. Fast forward to today, and Brooklyn is once again a magnet for immigrants. Just under 40% of the borough's residents were born abroad, and their arrival is what has allowed the borough's population to grow over the past 2 decades, despite negative net domestic migration. In other words, every year more native-born Americans leave Brooklyn than move in. However, the texture of immigrant life in Brooklyn today is dramatically different. For one, immigrants who settle in Bensonhurst and East Flatbush experience a much more dramatic improvement in their material well-being than did their forebears a century ago. GDP per capita in China and Mexico, 2 of the most common countries of origin for recent immigrants to New York, are both just shy of $9,000. US GDP per capita is $59,000. In 1914, America's per capita income was twice that of Germany's and 3 times as high as Italy's. And yet, despite the extraordinary one-time economic jump involved in merely making it to America's shores, many of today's immigrants face formidable obstacles to enter the middle class and society's mainstream. 1/5 of immigrant households have incomes below the poverty line, and many in New York City live in illegal dwellings, carved out of vacant basements, unused garages, and spare bedrooms. The data is hazy, but some experts estimate that there are somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 of these illegal units in the city, and they are almost always filled by the foreign-born. This burgeoning supply of illegal units is the direct result of the dearth of new legal units. Between 2006 and 2016, 6,000 new units were built each year in Brooklyn. A paltry number when you consider median rent rose by 50% during this period. Imagine that. From tens of thousands of new units every year to a paltry few thousand. Now, I submit to you that the immigrants making their lives in Brooklyn today are in no essential, spiritual way different from those who came through Ellis Island a century ago. Today's newcomers have the same potential and desire to make Brooklyn and cities like it cities of homes and churches, to do right by their aspirations and their families. So what has changed is really the country and the cities they find waiting for them. First, the America of the 21st century is a far more educated and affluent society than the America of a century ago, and working-class immigrants from poorer parts of the world therefore have further to climb than their counterparts from generations ago. Second, agricultural and industrial employment represent a far smaller share of the overall workforce than in the past. By and large, service sector jobs are the jobs that are on offer. And while service sector jobs can be very good jobs indeed, boosting productivity in the service sector has proven a tough nut to crack, as evidenced by the rising cost of education and medical care, to name 2 of the most important sectors of the modern American economy. Third, the America of yesteryear had yet to develop an extensive web of federal social programs designed to shield people from the vicissitudes of fortune. And so newcomers had little choice but to place their hopes in mutual aid societies and other voluntary organizations that aimed to cultivate independence and virtue. Fourth, there's a change that is more subtle but no less important. It is not just America's economy that has changed, but also its culture and what I'll call its tolerance for growth. The governing metaphor for American immigration was, for a very long time, the melting pot, which took the stunning diversity that arrived on our shores and fashioned an amalgamated people. The new arrivals were not molded to match the people who got here earlier, but rather together, Everyone became something new. Today, the melting pot does not comport with our understanding of identity as an immutable fact. Many of our institutions, from businesses to schools to government, divvy up the population based on race, ethnicity, gender, religious affiliation, and sexual preference, and in doing so suggest that those are the most important facts about us and the fault lines we ought to pay attention to in life and in politics. It is impossible to know how a similar preoccupation would have played out a century ago, but in our own more stagnant time, this breeds a sense of irreconcilable conflict. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the battles we wage over our stagnant built environment. If you do not build new housing, then normal turnover in neighborhoods stops being interpreted as the expected churn of a healthy and vigorous city, and instead comes to be viewed as the displacement of one group, of one tribe, by another. One of the more striking developments in urban politics in recent years has been the backlash against, quote, gentrification, the transformation of formerly poor neighborhoods into middle-class neighborhoods as well-off professionals move in. The fear is that these high-income newcomers will force out the low-income families that already live in the neighborhood, driving them to less desirable communities on the outskirts of the city. This conversation, like just about everything in modern America, typically gets bound up with a maddeningly counterproductive conversation about race. It happens that while we hear this gentrification story all the time, it's actually far less common than another urban story in which upwardly mobile immigrants move into high-poverty neighborhoods and help bring them back to life. That story, alas, is far less compelling as an anti-growth morality play, and so we don't hear about it quite as much. But whether we're talking about gentrification driven by yuppies or scrappy immigrants, notice the underlying assumption here that the number of units in the neighborhood is basically fixed and that growth is not an option. This zero-sum outlook is what you will find espoused by many big city politicians. Faced with rising rents, they don't call for allowing for the construction of new private housing that made cities like this one places of opportunity in generations past. No, what you hear are calls for rent control and for other regulations on private developers that will have the same effect, to limit the construction of new housing rather than to expand it, all in the name of protecting those who already live here. As for those who might want to find their fortunes here, to form families and build communities and churches of their own in the future, they are at best an afterthought. They are invisible. They are forgotten. What has been the result of these so-called protections? Roughly half of renters in New York City live in units with regulated rents, a proportion that may well rise in the years to come. To see just how much it pays to be on the right side of this system, consider these numbers. The median Brooklyn apartment costs $1,340 a month. But if you restrict your sample to just market rate apartments, that number shoots up to almost $3,000. Now that lawmakers have passed a new round of rent regulations, expect rents for market rate units to get even higher as more investors decide to steer clear of rental housing outright. And what will happen then? Will the zero-sum politicians admit they've made a terrible mistake and that they've made the crisis of housing affordability worse rather than better? What will they say to the hundreds of thousands relegated to living in illegal units, people desperate to pay for decent housing and who would happily do it if they could? Will they admit defeat? Of course not. They will call for still more rent regulation. They will call for more subsidies. They will call for more government to solve the very problems that they themselves created. When you dive into Brooklyn's housing market, what you see is a small band of winners, mainly people who are well organized and sophisticated at pulling political levers, and many more losers, especially immigrants and other outsiders who want to live affordably in one of the country's most dynamic labor markets, but lack the political clout to do so comfortably. The truth is that if you were concerned about displacement, the most logical thing to do would be to learn from the Brooklyn of yesteryear and to build up and to build out, to embrace private development and do everything in your power to make sure we make room for all those who want to make a life in the city, and to unleash human flourishing. A lot of ink has been spilled to warn against or mourn the death of an old Brooklyn. Yet the Brooklyn I told you about today was formed by people who did not think about what they ought to preserve, but instead dreamed of what they could build, and then did it. What we are in danger of losing is not any set of glazed brick buildings or brownstones or any irreplaceable landmark, but rather that peculiar American outlook on the future that says we will seize its opportunities and weather its challenges. And we must not let that spirit go. It makes us who we are, and it will carry us to new heights of prosperity if we let it. Thank you.